Hello and welcome to TGCon Live. Today's session is Standardizing Documentation for FSVP Compliance, where we'll be discussing the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, especially in light of recent events, and how TraceGain's standard online forms can be used to help monitor and record keep. Our speakers today are James Chu and James Yarbrough. James Yarbrough is a senior account executive for TraceGains. He started at the company in 2013 and has helped guide many companies along their food safety, quality, and compliance software buying processes. He's worked with notable companies such as Jiffy Mix, RX Bar, and Now Foods. James is PCQI certified and leads onboarding sessions to train new TraceGains employees on the food and beverage, supplement, and CPG evolving regulations and trends. James Chu is the Supplier Quality Manager for John B. Sanfilippo & Son, a leading processor and distributor of tree nuts and peanuts in the United States. Prior to JBSS, James spent a decade in a variety of quality management and corrective action roles across the food and beverage and medical industries, working for notable companies such as Kraft Heinz. As a certified PCQI Lead Instructor and a certified FSVP Lead Instructor, James brings a wealth of knowledge and industry know-how for businesses seeking to drive quality and compliance programs. James, both of you, thanks for joining us today. James Chu, let's go ahead and dig into our topic.
All right, thanks for the introduction. Again, I think we already touched a little bit of background on John B. Sanfilippo & Son. We've been a growing leader in the snack food industry and known internationally for the Fisher brand name. We are a processor, packager, and marketer of a wide variety of nut and snack nut products. The topics that I will be touching on: take a brief review of the main points of the FSVP regulation. We'll then take a look at current FDA enforcement action data that has been collected so far. Also, as an importer of mainly tree nuts and fruits, I also want to take the time to point out one key import alert, as I'm sure if you subscribe to the FDA alerts, the email can be pretty daunting to try to review all the new alerts, but this one is particularly important. Next, we'll look at the 3 guidance documents that were issued by the FDA as it relates to FSVP. We will outline key points for you to be aware of and a walkthrough of an FSVP remote inspection to give you an idea of what to expect. Finally, I want to introduce to you an FSVP form that was created with the help of TraceGains that can help prove FSVP compliance. FSVP is the cornerstone of FSMA's preventive risk-based approach to import. Importers must provide adequate assurances that foreign suppliers produce food using processes and procedures that provide the same level of public health protection as the FSMA preventive controls or produce safety provisions. Additionally, food must not be adulterated or misbranded as it pertains to allergen labeling. The official FDA document is found in 21 CFR Part 1 of Subpart L. There are 15 sections that outline this rule. The key principles to the rule are: it requires importers to share responsibility for ensuring safety of imported food. It is a risk-based approach according to types of hazards, importers, and suppliers. There's also flexibility in terms of meeting requirements, such as accessing activities conducted by others. And it also is aligned with the preventive control supply chain provisions as well. So who must comply? The rule states the following. The importer is the U.S. owner or consignee of a food at the time of U.S. entry. If no U.S. owner or consignee at entry, the importer is the U.S. agent or representative of the foreign owner or consignee as confirmed in a signed statement of consent. For the purposes of FSVP, the definition of the term importer is the U.S. owner or consignee of an article of food offered for import into the U.S. This is the person in the United States who, at the time of entry of an article of food into the United States, either owns the food, has purchased the food, or has agreed in writing to purchase the food. With every rule, there are always exceptions. The FDA also did not want to double up on foods that were already under regulation. The following categories are exempted from the FSVP rule: firms subject to juice or seafood HACCP regulations, alcoholic beverages and alcoholic beverage ingredients, meat, poultry, and egg products subject to USDA regulation at time of importation, food for research or evaluation, food for personal consumption, food transshipped through the U.S., food imported for processing and export, so food that is not being sold in the U.S., and then also low-acid canned food facilities. Keep in mind that for low-acid canned foods, the only exception is for the microbiological hazards. All other hazards, chemical and physical, still need to be evaluated and must comply with the rest of the rule. In general, many of the FSVP requirements are very similar to FSMA's supply chain program. A hazard analysis is required. You must evaluate the food and the foreign supplier, perform supplier verification activities, document corrective actions, be the proper importer identification at entry, and provide record keeping such as reevaluation frequency. FSVP also requires qualified individuals must be utilized to perform all FSVP tasks. They all must have education, training, or experience, or a combination thereof, necessary to perform the activity. It also says that they must be able, that if documents are in a foreign language, the individual must be able to read and understand the language of any records reviewed in performing the activity. Please keep in mind that this is not the same as the PCQI in the human food rule. The next thing we wanted to look at are FSVP enforcement actions. Since 2017, when the rule was enforced, the FDA has been keeping track of the results. The link posted at the bottom of this slide has a real-time update from the FDA. This shows results only for completed inspections and not any that are currently in progress. In 2017, the first year of enforcement, 285 inspections were completed. In 2018, 795, and in 2019, 858. So far, as of May 26, 2020, there are only 194 that have been closed. From the data gathered so far, the top three observations from completed inspections are: 1, the failure to develop an FSVP; 2, having a written hazard analysis to identify and evaluate known or reasonably foreseeable hazards; and the third, failure to document your approval of your foreign supplier. It is also important to recognize in the first 2 years, 2017 and 2018, the FDA was in the educate before you regulate mode, so the number of observations were not as frequent in this adjustment period. From 2019 moving forward, it appears the FDA has shifted that thinking more towards the regulate side. As a result, there have been an increase in 483s and a total of 18 FSVP warning letters issued in the past 2 years. Speaking of warning letters, I wanted to bring attention to you an import alert 9941. Detention without physical examination of human and animal foods imported from foreign suppliers by importers who are not in compliance with the requirements of the FSVP regulation. This import alert was created on July 31st, 2019. The key points for this alert: an importer may be added to this import alert because there appears to be a non-compliance with FSVP requirements. Specific food or foods from a specific foreign supplier are subject to detention with importer or offered for import by the identified importer. The importer may be subject to detention without physical examination for all food they import if it appears that the importer is in violation of the FSVP requirements of all such foods. Even when an importer is not in compliance with FSVP, the food or foreign supplier may still be in compliance with applicable requirements. The only food that may be subject to detention without physical examination under this import alert is the specified food when it is imported by the identified importer, but not necessarily when imported by others. Simply put, the FDA is becoming aware of importer and supplier relationships that are not compliant with FSVP and created an import alert for it, so it will be held sort of like a bad list. Also note, this is an importer-supplier relationship. The same food from a different importer or vice versa may not trigger the hold. Currently, there are 5 FSVP importers that are listed on this import alert 9941. Next, we wanted to look at some FDA guidance policies. The FDA has published 3 guidance documents, 2 of which are temporary policies due to the current coronavirus pandemic. Foreign supplier verification programs for importers of food for human and animals, regulations, records requirement, an on-site audit enforcement, and remote inspections. Let's take a closer look at these 3 guidances. The first guidance was published on October 2nd, 2019. The FDA published a guidance document, Foreign Supplier Verification Programs for Importers of Food for Humans and Animals, Regulation Records Requirement. This document outlines records that can be used to meet FSVP requirements and provides guidance on what the record should contain. Some of the documents highlighted are a hazard analysis or risk assessment. This must include biological, chemical, and physical hazards, as well as consideration for foreseeable hazards. Internal procedures for importing and approved suppliers. On-site audits, which should include audit procedures, dates, conclusions, corrective actions, and performed by a qualified auditor. Sampling and testing of food should include number of samples tested, types of tests, dates of tests on the report of the results, testing laboratory, and any corrective action, if any, were needed. A review of foreign supplier food safety records also should include dates and the general nature of the records reviewed, as well as the conclusions. Record retention also must be at least 2 years. In March of 2020, the FDA also released a statement due to the coronavirus pandemic. Due to travel and health precautions, the FDA will not be enforcing on-site audit requirements for 3 regulations: human food, animal food, and FSVP. For FSVP purposes, the FDA does not intend to force the requirement for an on-site audit in the FSVP regulation, provided that the receiving facility or FSVP importer has determined that an on-site audit is the appropriate verification activity for an approved supplier, as reflected by its written food safety plan or foreign supplier verification program. In terms of other verification activities in place of the audit, the FDA does mention example verification activities such as sampling and testing of food and reviewing of relevant food safety records. Whatever is decided, the verification must be sufficient to assure that the hazard requiring control has been significantly minimized or prevented. FSVP and food safety plans also should be updated accordingly. On April 3rd of 2020, the FDA announced that the agency would also start remote inspections for FSVP importers. In rare situations, such as in response to an outbreak of foodborne illness, FDA may choose to conduct an on-site FSVP inspection. In these instances, an FDA investigator will make arrangements to conduct the inspection while practicing the social distancing recommendations provided by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. While it's still possible for them to knock on your door, it appears on-site FSVP audits are moving towards for-cause and re-inspections. Since FSVP audits are mainly records reviews, it also seems this may be the new way for enforcement. Many of these have been conducted through email. A request will come to you if you are listed as the importer of record. As with any FDA audit, make sure your records are complete and you provide what they are asking for. You should still receive a 482 notice of inspection. So for the remote inspections, I wanted to walk you through an experience I had with an FSVP remote inspection and how it all went. This should provide you some expectations of what you might face if it comes up to you. The first thing that we had was a pre-inspection phone call. The FSVP importer identity will be determined. They're trying to determine if you're really it. Are you really the importer? If you're the importer, this is a very simple question. However, if you purchase through a broker, make sure you understand who is responsible. As mentioned earlier in the importer definition, if you have a written contract, you could be the responsible party even though you are not the importer of record. The investigator will also provide to you the following information. They will share with you the date of import, the customs entry number, line number, product description, and company that you are importing from. The inspector will also have images or pictures of the packaging, labeling, and all import documents to verify. You must also verify that this item was received in your facility. The inspector will also provide instructions for sending FSVP records to the investigator. Just a simple note, some investigators conduct solely through email, where you will be sending your records to. There are some FDA divisions that actually have an FDA secure portal for you to use. As you can see from the information above, FSVP inspections are typically looking at a very specific item, not the entire program for everything, although if there are gaps, it is fair game to review. The next day, as expected, the issuance of the FDA 482D, the request for FSVP records, was received. You must reply so the inspector knows that you have received the request. The inspector provides the item-specific details discussed on the call and also included the following references. He lists the key requirements, the final rule for foreign supplier verification programs, the final rule for the foreign supplier verification programs, FSVP record requirements. This should be a useful guide to determine which records are required as each part of the FSVP plan. He also included a generic FSVP plan document to demonstrate/outline what an FSVP plan should include. Firms who have not yet implemented an FSVP plan tend to find this more helpful as a guide. These are also the FSVP templates that were found in the training class by the FSPCA. He also provides useful links for the industry, including links to the FDA's FSVP website. Records are sent to FDA upon receipt. They request immediate receipt. However, rule provisions from the FSVP rule allow you 24 hours to obtain documents that are held off-site. In the instance that I have, the documents that were requested were the written supply chain and approval procedures, the hazard analysis and risk assessment for the items, where there were 3 of them that they called up for in this instance, supplier approval documentation, the documentation of the approval of the supplier, and reevaluation of the supplier. This actually was not provided in my instance, since there was no cause to reevaluate and the time frame had not elapsed for a reevaluation to become due. Once the records were reviewed, a follow-up conference will be scheduled. So when that follow-up call is done, you conduct a virtual inspection with the importer. It took about an hour, and we had 3 items of interest. The inspector summarized key requirements and the final rule, and I believe that is a requirement for them to do for everything, for every audit. The inspector then walks through the document trail from start, our process of supplier approval, to finish, the importer identification at entry. Questions that came up for us were around the hazard analysis and how do you determine what did we put in our hazard analysis? How did come in with an import alert for the same item from a different country and ask to explain how this would be noticed? And then reevaluation frequency. The rule says you must review at a minimum of every 3 years. We had not reached that point with any of our 3 items. The next step that we have after this conference call is the issuance of any observations. We did not have any observations, so the closeout meeting was held right away. I have heard from other industry experiences that there has been a second call with management to explain observation findings and disclose disposition. Importers were also able to provide corrective action updates and then close out the inspections. companies have 15 business days to respond to 483s. Since the scope of the FSVP was limited to 3 specific items in my instance, it seemed rather organized as there was limited information to review and talk about. Our inspector was also new to the regulation, so it did take some patience to understand how we interpret the rule and our actions. Overall, he was in agreement with our actions. So one of the things that we wanted to bring up with the help of TraceGains was a form that was helped develop to demonstrate FSVP compliance. The intent of this form is that it can be sent to an importer for completion or responsible party or completed by oneself if you are the importer. This form does incorporate most of the guidance information mentioned above and also contains a place for qualified individual sign-offs as well as facility sign-offs for when your facility reviews records performed by someone else. Let's look at some of the areas that were mentioned earlier. One of the most common observations issued by the FDA during the FSVP audit is conducting and documenting a hazard analysis of the item. All biological, chemical, physical hazards can be identified here, as well as a supply chain control if necessary. This form is dynamic based on your answers to questions. For example, look at the chemical hazard section. If you answer yes to chemical hazards, there is a prompt for the next question. If you answer no, this does not pop up. There is also some possibility from the TraceGains side to link this information from the item questionnaire, which also lists the hazard analysis. The third most common observation mentioned was around documenting the approval of a foreign supplier. This section will document the records that were reviewed from the supplier and item side. For the supplier, on the left side of the screen, there is a built-in link to the FDA website for regulatory review for recalls, warning letters, and import alerts. There is also drop-down sections for you to document your review of audits, certificates, or any other requirements that are in your supplier approval program. The item side is also very similar, containing recall, warning letter, and import alert reviews, and with the documentation section open for item-specific information such as C of A's, pesticide screens if you have a supply chain control, validation records, or heavy metal testing. This is also a dynamic form, whereas if you need to add a document, you can click on the green buttons to add a line, or to remove a line, you can use the red X's on the right-hand side. All documents should be attached to the records for completeness. At the end of each section for the supplier and the item, there also is a place to document corrective actions, if any are needed, and an approval sign-off. You can set the item to approve, conditionally approved, or not approved. For conditional approvals, there is also a comment field below where you can list more specific information when necessary. For record keeping and monitoring, there is a portion at the bottom of the form for this. The FSVP rule states that foreign suppliers should be reevaluated at a minimum of at least every 3 years, but can be sooner depending on risk. This reevaluation frequency can also be set at the beginning of this form. Some questions on this form, like if the item has a Sakota hazard, will automatically default the expiration to 1 year based on the rule. For monitoring purposes, a dashboard can be created so you can see when your FSVP records need to be reevaluated to stay in compliance. Just a quick reminder, the form doesn't automatically prove FSVP compliance. Part of the rule also includes having written procedures for approval and reevaluation on what you would document in this form. Finally, after using some of these forms and getting some feedback, there is some feedback that we have. The current form does not have an option for suppliers that qualify for modified requirements, but you can still document the review of that supplier. Exemptions or exceptions, such as low-acid canned foods, are not called out specifically. And for a regulatory review, there's potential that there could be some interaction with TraceGains Smart Alerts. This concludes my presentation for the FSVP, and I will throw it back.
Thanks so much, James. I'm now going to turn it over to Mr. Yarbrough, who's going to discuss trace gains a little bit more in depth, specifically how we extract data to power your documents and help them work for you. And he's going to touch on our standard online forms and really what a difference this has made for our customers in the industry. James, it's all yours.
Thanks, James. Very well done, and thank you, everybody, for joining this afternoon. I just have a few slides from the trace gain standpoint as far as how our software is designed to help, how we're partnering with the industry to assist in things like foreign supplier verification, and really showcase to things like auditors and customers that want that information to know that you have the proper controls in place. Now, that being said, most of you on the call, I'm sure, are fairly familiar with trace gains as a software company, and we do provide a suite of software products and modules that all connect up to what we call trace gains network. And this is a network designed to automate and streamline and revolutionize information exchange across the supply chain. And within those different modules, one that James is kind of talking about and that really this form ties into specifically is what we call our supplier management tool that allows you to automate, streamline all of the compliance and regulatory documentation to prove that you have a program in place, whether they're suppliers and items buying from North America or any foreign supplier around the world. And that could be a litany of different things as far as types of suppliers you're working with, right? It might be a direct supplier from a foreign country. It may be through a broker and distributor, in which case the relationship might be a little bit different. And you have to have different setups in a system like trace gains to be able to handle those types of relationships. But as you can see, the idea is really to connect the proper stakeholders across the supply chain in a seamless fashion, build standards like the standards FSVP form we've worked with James Chu and others to help make sure that we're asking the right questions, that it's staying relevant to the rules and so on. But the other big part is you have to extract the data, and that's something that trace gains is well known for in how our solution is delivered, is this ability to take data off of things like FSVP form, or even a supplier questionnaire, or an item risk form, or a country of origin form, or an allergen form, so that you can have better insight and analytics and reporting capability against your supply chain. Not just, hey, do we have the documents? Obviously, that's an important part. But also, what's inside those documents? What's the information and the data that our supply chain is telling us that's, again, relevant to us conducting risk analysis, us conducting audits when auditors come through, and just kind of staying on top of our supply chain in a more efficient manner. James kind of went over this, so I don't want to hit on this too much, but again, we've built the form, and there's a lot of unique questions that we've worked on to make sure, again, that this form is relevant for FSVP rules. But as I explained a few minutes ago, we also have forms around lots of other types of data that you would want to connect and get from your supply chain, right? Whether that's a supplier or distributor you work with. Hey, you import the product from somewhere. I need to qualify you as an importer or a broker, but I also need to then know where that item comes from and the original source supplier as I go through my risk assessment and understanding the supply chain of the companies I'm working with. And so trace gains can allow you to leverage a lot of data coming off forms, and this can drive different reports and things like that. What you see here is our ability to tie the data in from results and answers that you've been given from your suppliers within the supplier management tool that then can drive things like geo-mapping of where your items are coming from. And then from there, you can even do other unique things with the data that's coming into trace gains in not just supplier management, but potentially other modules that can then drive things like color coding and risk heat maps and help you not only know where stuff is coming from, but also maybe make some decisions about where you may go audit next, or how you're going to handle a certain type of ingredient. Maybe you need a secondary supplier of that ingredient because it's too risky or something like that. And so we help you drive the data on things like a geomap And then here you see an example briefly of a quick little risk report and dashboard that might be able to showcase, again, relevant data when it comes to your supply chain, the items you're buying, the suppliers you're working with. And now all of these tools that we've built at TraceGains and all of this data that comes in, it goes back to what we talked about, what James talked about earlier in regards to the top 3 citations and things like documentation and workflow and audit trail. You obviously want to know who the original source supplier is, so being able to have that data. And then also to the point that James alluded to as far as the new rules around COVID and the FDA and inspectors may be doing more of virtual audits or more desk audit types where it's like, hey, I need some documentation from you. Please support and provide that for me. TraceGains allows companies a very easy way to get access to the proper information that an auditor may be looking for. You can do things like share a screen and how you're currently looking at risk, how you're currently managing documents. You can easily forward documentation out of the system. So there's a number of ways that companies can leverage TraceGains to run through those audits, especially nowadays that most of those audits are going virtual, and auditors are going to want to see some data and information. Even as they may come on site in the future, they may want that before they come on site. But definitely right now with more audits being virtual, how do we get the information to an auditor that's relevant? So with that, I think that's really all I had, just kind of introducing our solution, introducing how we partner with the industry to build standards. We partner with companies like John B. Sanfilippo & Son and folks like James Chu to really help us, understand what you guys need in the world of the food and beverage space, and how that, how we can drive solutions to really help everyone. So I'll pause there.
Now I'd like to introduce Anthony Arocha and Zach Underwood. They are both part of our customer success team responsible for implementation, and they head up our customer advisory group. I'm actually going to go ahead and share the slide that shows the companies that take part in this. This group is focused on driving improvements to TraceGains standard online forms that benefit the business. TraceGains bases the forms on best practices with the goal of simplifying the supply chain. Each stakeholder's needs are shared, and the feedback helps to refine the forms further. Anthony and Zach, thank you for joining us. Could you share just a little bit more about this process?
Hey, how you guys doing? You have myself, Anthony Arocha, and Zach Underwood here. Okay, so last little item is the development of the forms, right? Just a little bit more about the process. If you have a question about the content of any of these standard online forms, or if you have a change that you would like to see, we take all of these proposals and we send it through our internal groups. We discuss it, and then, like Anthony mentioned, there are times where we'll send a blast out to everybody who's in this customer advisory group to get the community feedback and make sure that the proposed change is right for the TraceGains community as a whole. So when you make these proposed changes, we really take the time to vet the change, gather all of the required information so that we can keep these forms as accurate, up to date, and useful as possible.
Thank you, Anthony and Zach. If any of the attendees would like some information about joining the customer advisory group, we'll be sharing an email address that you can reach out to Zach and Anthony about joining this great group and having some input on these forms. But now we're going to switch gears and move over to our Q&A. We have a couple of questions that have already come in. We'll go ahead and start with those. The first question comes from Daniel. He writes, if I purchase product from an importer, what is the best method for ensuring that the importer is FSVP compliant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's the communication with your importer. That's the best way to find out if they are in compliance with it. Clearly, I hope they don't show up on that import list. That means they're not. But it's the communication between you and your importer that should determine who that is. Something that will also help is if you actually see the customs, the CBP, Customs and Border Protection, if you see the application of how they import. It also should dictate on that form. There's a form actually for the FSVP importer. That is the person that the FDA would question about FSVP compliance. So if you actually were to see that border entry item, that would be the surest way to find out who the FDA would hold responsible for it.
Thank you, James. The next question is, who is responsible for on-site audits? Is it the broker or myself?
So for on-site audits, this is one of the flexibility requirements that we mentioned earlier about it. You are able to, if you don't do the on-site audit yourself, you are able to review someone else's and call it good or bad. That is at the judgment of, that is your judgment to do that. A lot of companies have been using like some of those standard audits like a BRC or, an SQF. They've been using audits like that. They've been using that to say, I'm not going to do it. I accept that, the grading criteria and everything in there. But honestly, you have the flexibility to either do it yourself or review someone else who has done it. As the requirement states, you must review it, document the review of it, and sign it off, and then put it into your FSVP.
James, the FDA recently announced that they are going to restart on-site audits. Will the FDA auditors comply with companies' temperature-taking processes if they come on site?
I believe that they are. It seems like a lot of the temporary procedures for audits are they will comply with whatever the CDC says. And, if that's what people are doing, I've not heard anyone that has refused it. I've not seen any instances where they have refused it. But I believe they are supposed to comply with everything that is in your facility. The same, just like I think sometimes there was like a picture question that was going around for a long time as well too. But they should be in compliance with all of your facility processes. So if getting your temperature taken is part of it, they do need to go through that.
The next question asks, do records of imported goods need to be translated? This attendee is specifically asking about Spanish, but I think it's a broader question as well. James, could you answer that one?
So for FSVP compliance, if they are in Spanish, you have to make sure that whoever has them reviewed is Spanish speak, can read and understand Spanish. When you actually get audited, it's most likely they will ask for an English translation. Unless the auditor is able to read and understand Spanish, that would not be, who knows? I can't guarantee that. If they can, they might not ask for it, but if they do, they probably would want an English translation for it.
Next question is from Taylor. She wants to know, can you provide insight on who the FDA chooses to inspect? Is it random?
The first 2 years, they were doing high-risk items. And I think now it's becoming more and more random or maybe trendy. So I think you saw a lot with, tahini because that became a very hot topic very fast. So I think it's random, but if they find something that makes them want to push that forward, then they will actually push those items forward.
James, how often do companies need to review the approved items or suppliers on their FSVP list?
Mm-hmm. So every 3 years, they do ask for, they want you to reevaluate your supplier. So what they don't want is for you to basically approve it and then never look at it again. The 3-year approval will look at, did they have any import rejections? Did they have any alerts? Did they have any recalls? They want you to start reviewing those on on some type of frequency to help keep the international food safe. And so that's what they're looking for that 3-year review. You could possibly do like a reapproval all over again, as long as you walk it through your process. Or again, they always ask for that written procedure of what you would do for your reevaluation. And as long as you have a written procedure that says, I look at, these 5 things, and you can prove that you looked at those 5 things, then that would suffice for their requirement.
Next question is, what recommendations do you have for retailers that purchase imported items from a broker?
So in terms of FSVP, it's very much the communication between you and the broker. For example, I think we mentioned before, looking at that Customs and Border Protection, looking at that application, that import application when the food comes in, that really tells you who they're putting the responsibility on for it. That's really who the FDA will ask. I mentioned in the temporary audit that that I had gone through previously, that they talked about you're determining of whether you're actually if you're actually responsible for it. We do have there have been instances where some brokers or importers will put someone in there that doesn't actually have or isn't actually responsible for that food. And so they want to verify. That's why, like on that preliminary call that I walked you through, they want to determine that you're really the one that is responsible for it. In the event that you're not really the one responsible for it, I don't know what happens. But that's part of the reason, like they want to make sure that the entry application was filled out correctly. You're really the responsible party, and you're acknowledging that you're responsible for it as well too. That was part of that initial call setup that we had. So if that happens for you, you should be able to say, that's where they're getting their information from.
Thanks, James. We have one last question. Mary wants to know if you could speak to how dietary supplements are handled under FSVP.
I believe dietary supplements have their own subcategory in the FSVP, even in the training sessions. Dietary supplements are treated a little bit differently. They have they have a different kind of exemption, not exemption, but they have a different set of requirements that are slightly different. Again, when I look through some of a lot of the FSVP observations, I have not seen a lot of dietary supplements. I can double check and look again and see. I have not seen a lot of them come through. I've seen a few, but I think they have really been focusing a lot more on food than I have seen on the other categories.
Thanks so much, James. And that will wrap up our question and answer portion of the session. I want to thank James Chu and James Yarbrough, as well as Anthony Arocha and Zach Underwood for joining us today. I hope you found this session helpful. And just as a reminder, the presentation will be uploaded to the TGCon Live site, so you can download the presentation and share with your peers after today. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great rest of TGCon. Bye, everyone.